Liam Harper stood in the shadows of the auction hall, the hum of activity surrounding him. The place was a mess, a rundown spaceport on the edge of the galaxy where no one with a real reputation would go. But for Liam, it was perfect. He didn't need flashy items or big-name tech. He just needed cheap things to flip for a profit, and this auction promised plenty of that. Or at least, that's what he hoped. The auctioneer, a scruffy man with a greasy smile, leaned into the mic. Next up, Lot 32, untouched salvage from the Korean War. A mix of metal scrap and useless junk. His voice echoed across the room as Liam scanned the lot on the screen. It was exactly the kind of thing Liam liked. Worn-out starship parts, damaged tech, maybe even a few old weapons. The type of stuff nobody else wanted. Liam gripped his datapad, his eyes locked on the screen. He didn't have a lot of credits to spare, but he'd been saving up for a few months, hoping for just this opportunity. If he won, he could sell whatever was in that lot and make a nice profit. Nothing special, just another day in the life of a scavenger. Opening bid. 50 credits. The auctioneer called out, looking around the room. "Will give me 50. Liam's thumb hovered over the button. It was a low price, but he knew the real competition wouldn't start until the bidding went up. A few others raised their hands, but the bid didn't climb much higher than 200 credits. That was still affordable for him. His heart started to beat faster. He didn't know what was in the lot, but he didn't care. Whatever it was, he'd find a way to make it work. 200 credits, Liam muttered under his breath, pressing the button. The screen flashed, confirming his bid. 200 credits. Anyone going higher? The auctioneer's voice cut through the crowd. People started to murmur, unsure if they wanted to get involved. It wasn't a glamorous lot, just scrap from a forgotten war. But for Liam, it was a chance. A few seconds passed, and the room fell into a quiet lull. Nobody raised their hand. It was too much for most people. After all, who wanted a bunch of rusty old parts when they could bid on high-tech gadgets or salvage from more recent conflicts? Going once, the auctioneer called out. Liam leaned forward in his seat, watching the timer tick down. He knew he was about to win this one. His fingers tightened around the datapad. This was it. His big break. Going twice, the auctioneer said, his voice stretching into the silence. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Sold to the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer cried, snapping his fingers. Liam couldn't hide the smile that spread across his face. He had won the lot, and with it, whatever treasure or junk was inside. He'd have to collect it after the auction. But for now, he was already thinking of the possibilities. A few broken pieces of tech might be just what he needed to get back on his feet. It was a win, no matter what was inside. As the room began to clear out, Liam made his way to the pickup area. There were a few other bidders, but they weren't interested in his lot. They had gone after the more valuable items. Liam didn't mind. This was his niche. He didn't care about the fancy stuff. He'd take whatever people discarded and turn it into something worthwhile. When it was his turn to collect the lot, he was handed a small sealed crate. It wasn't much to look at, but it felt solid, heavier than he expected. He didn't think much of it. The crate wasn't big, barely larger than a backpack, but it was clearly well packaged. "Enjoy your purchase, sir," the clerk said with a small smile, clearly amused by the low-key nature of Liam's lot compared to the bigger bids. "Thanks," Liam replied, keeping his excitement in check. He wasn't going to get too hopeful. He'd seen plenty of boxes like this before, filled with nothing more than useless parts. He carried the crate back to his ship, a worn-out freighter that had seen better days. The ship's engines were still functional, but it wasn't much to look at. It was the perfect vessel for a scavenger like Liam. Cheap to run and easy to maintain. He wasn't in the business of luxury. He was just trying to survive. Once inside the cramped cargo bay, Liam set the crate down. He stared at it for a moment, wondering if there was something valuable hidden inside. Maybe there was a rare piece of alien technology, something he could sell for a fortune. He'd been lucky before, finding hidden gems in the most unlikely of places. But he told himself it was probably just a bunch of scrap. Liam opened the crate, carefully peeling back the protective seal. Inside, he found a bundle of strange fabric. It wasn't metal or tech, not the kind of salvage he was used to. He frowned, confused. Was this some kind of alien clothing? He hadn't seen anything like it before. The fabric shimmered slightly, almost as if it had a life of its own. He pulled it out cautiously, but then his eyes widened. Beneath the fabric, something shifted. Something alive. Liam froze. At first, he thought it was a small animal, maybe some kind of creature caught in the crate. But as the fabric shifted, he realized this was no animal. It was a humanoid figure, barely breathing, pale and unmoving. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Wah! What is this? Liam whispered to himself, his mind racing. He'd thought he was bidding on junk. But this was something completely different. For a moment, he just stood there, frozen. He didn't know what to do. He hadn't signed up for this, but something inside him stirred. A sense of responsibility, something deeper than just a scavenger's greed. Without thinking, he carefully checked the alien girl for signs of life. There was still a faint pulse. She was alive, but barely. Liam swallowed hard, his mind working quickly. Whatever this was, it was no ordinary purchase. He had to figure out who she was, and why someone would want to hide her away in a crate marked as salvage. But for now, all he could do was wait. Liam sat on the cold, metal floor of his cargo bay, staring at the strange figure before him. The alien girl lay unconscious, her features delicate yet unmistakably otherworldly. The fabric that had once covered her shimmered faintly in the dim light, almost as if it were still alive. The room was silent, the only sounds coming from the quiet hum of his ship's failing engines. Liam had seen his share of odd things over the years. Strange debris, rare artifacts, and damaged tech were the usual fare. But this was something different. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into. The girl's appearance alone suggested she was no ordinary being. Her skin, almost metallic in its sheen, glinted in the low light. Her hair was a strange shade of silver, soft and flowing, and her eyes, when he had briefly seen them, were bright, almost glowing. He had never dealt with an alien life form before. He'd heard stories of people finding rare creatures in the deep parts of space, but nothing like this. This wasn't just some lost animal. This was a person, and from the way she was dressed, it looked like she was far from being just some wanderer. Liam reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently touching her shoulder. She felt warm, and the soft rise and fall of her chest told him she was still alive. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but he wasn't out of danger yet. He had no idea who she was or why she was hidden in a crate, and whoever had sent her was bound to come looking. He sat back and tried to calm himself, staring at the girl. There were so many questions swirling in his mind. What had happened to her? Why was she so important that someone would go to all this trouble? And who exactly was coming for her? His mind raced, but just as quickly, his thoughts turned to the immediate problem. He needed to get her to a safer place. Someone would come looking soon enough. He had to act fast. He stood up, brushing the dust from his pants, and moved toward the small medical kit he kept on the ship. As a scavenger, he often had to deal with minor injuries. Nothing too serious, but enough to know how to patch someone up in a pinch. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew how to help someone until they got proper care. Liam rummaged through the kit and pulled out some basic supplies, a hypo spray for pain relief, a few bandages, and some medical scans. He wasn't sure what kind of biology the girl had, but it was better to be safe than sorry. He placed the scanner over her arm, watching as the device beeped and whirred. The results were odd, but nothing that immediately worried him. The girl's vitals were stable, though weak, and the scan revealed an advanced biological system that Liam couldn't fully understand. There were things inside her body that didn't seem human. Enhancements, maybe. He wasn't sure, but it definitely wasn't normal. He set the scanner down and looked at her face again. He couldn't help but notice how peaceful she looked now, her breathing steady and soft. There was something almost otherworldly about her calmness. Despite the strange situation, Liam felt a sense of responsibility he hadn't expected. She was vulnerable, and she had nowhere else to go. He couldn't just leave her out there. Not like this. Liam glanced around the small cargo bay. His ship was a mess, tools scattered everywhere, old crates piled in the corners. There was no place here to really care for someone, especially someone as important as this girl seemed to be. He needed to find somewhere safe, a place where they wouldn't be found easily. He turned back to the girl, still unconscious, and felt a pang of guilt. Was it right to help her? She wasn't just some lost soul. She was something more. And what if he was getting into something he couldn't handle? What if the people looking for her were dangerous? But no matter how much he tried to convince himself to turn away, he couldn't. Something about the girl's presence stirred a protective instinct within him. She needed him. And for reasons he couldn't understand, he couldn't walk away. After a few moments of silent reflection, Liam stood up and began to prepare the ship for launch. It was still in rough condition, but it would get them out of the spaceport. He couldn't stay here any longer. If anyone was tracking him, staying put would be a huge mistake. He had no idea who was after her, but he could guess it wasn't anyone friendly. Liam moved quickly, strapping the girl into one of the seat belts in the main cabin. Her body was light, almost too light for her size. As he made sure she was secure, he felt a strange sense of unease. There was something about her that felt different, like she was more than just a person. Her skin, her eyes, even the way she held herself, it all screamed that she was something beyond ordinary. With the girl secured, Liam started the ship's engines and lifted off. The small freighter hummed to life, the engines sputtering slightly before they kicked into gear. It wasn't the smoothest flight, but it was enough to get them away from the spaceport. Liam steered the ship toward an uncharted system he knew, a place far off the main trade routes, far enough to hide out for a while. As the ship entered hyperspace, Liam leaned back in his seat, trying to relax. But his mind couldn't settle. He glanced over at the girl again. She hadn't stirred since he'd secured her. And for a moment, he wondered if she was even aware of what was happening around her. Then, to his surprise, he heard her voice, soft, almost a whisper in his mind. "Where am I?" Liam's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a sound he could hear with his ears, but it was clear as day in his head. She was telepathic. That was new. His eyes widened, and he quickly glanced at her. Was she awake? No, her eyes were still closed, but it was her voice. He was sure of it. "You're safe," Liam said, surprised at how calm his own voice sounded. The girl's eyes flickered open, her gaze fixed on him with a depth that sent a shiver down his spine. She didn't speak aloud, but her thoughts were clear. She didn't seem afraid, but she was curious. "Who are you?" Liam swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. This was far more than he had bargained for. But he knew one thing for sure. There was no going back now. "I'm Liam," he said, his voice steady. "And I think you're in trouble." Liam sat at the control panel of his ship, his fingers nervously tapping against the worn buttons. The lights of hyperspace streaked across the cockpit windows, the colors of blue and purple flashing by it as the ship sped through the dark void of space. He couldn't stop thinking about the alien girl sitting in the seat beside him. She had barely spoken since he had found her, but her eyes never left him, watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. His mind was racing. The girl was special. He could feel it, even if he didn't fully understand why. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met. Her telepathic words had shaken him, but he hadn't been able to ask her much before she fell silent again. She wasn't fully awake yet, But Liam couldn't shake the feeling that she was more than just some lost traveler. She was a key to something much bigger, and whoever had sent her in that crate was sure to come looking. Liam glanced over at the coordinates on the navigation screen. He was headed to a remote part of space, far from the main trade routes, a place where he could hide out for a while. It wasn't much, but it was all he could think of. The girl needed time to recover, and he needed time to figure out what he was going to do. As the ship entered normal space, the quiet hum of the engines was replaced by the soft hiss of the atmosphere. The planet below was a dusty, desolate world, far from civilization. There were no spaceports here, no big cities, just empty stretches of land, perfect for hiding out. Liam set the ship down in a secluded canyon, far from the nearest settlement. He quickly powered down the engines and unbuckled his seatbelt, glancing over at the girl. She had not moved since they entered normal space, but her eyes were still open, staring at him as if waiting for something. "Stay here," Liam said, speaking to her for the first time aloud. "I'll find us a place to rest. You need to recover." The girl blinked, and for a moment, Liam thought she might speak. But then the silence stretched on, and he turned to leave. He didn't know what to say to her, didn't know what she needed. He wasn't prepared for any of this. He was a scavenger, not a hero. He didn't know how to protect someone like her. As he exited the ship and began to walk toward the cliffs of the canyon, his thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, distant but growing louder. His hand instinctively went to the blaster at his side. Someone was coming. He hurried back to the ship and climbed inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The ship's sensors were already alerting him to an incoming ship, something big. The unmistakable hum of an engine grew louder, and soon enough, Liam could see the shadow of the craft moving across the sky. His pulse quickened as he realized it wasn't just one ship. It was a whole fleet. A dozen ships, all coming straight toward him. Whoever was after the girl wasn't wasting any time. They had tracked him down faster than he had expected. Liam quickly hit the controls, firing up the engines. He had to get out of there, but the ships were already in range. They were closing in fast, and he could feel the tension building as the seconds ticked by. He knew he wasn't going to outrun them, but he had to try. There was no other choice. He punched the throttle, sending the ship hurtling into the sky, the canyon walls whizzing by in a blur. "Hang on," Liam shouted, knowing the girl wasn't in a position to respond. The enemy ships fired at him as they came into range. Liam swerved, dodging the blasts with all the skill he had learned from years of dodging bounty hunters and angry merchants. The ship's shields held, but only just. He could feel the jolts with each hit, and the systems flickered as sparks flew from the control panels. He glanced at the girl, still strapped into her seat, her face pale, but her eyes wide and alert. She didn't seem scared, just focused. And then, in a flash, Liam saw something he hadn't expected. A glow, faint at first, coming from her hands. The air around her seemed to shimmer as if she were gathering energy. "Don't," Liam started, but before he could finish, the girl's hands glowed brightly, and suddenly the ship lurched forward, propelled by an unseen force. The enemy ships were sent tumbling off course, as though caught in an invisible wave. Liam barely managed to keep control of the ship, but it was enough to get them out of the immediate danger. "Did you just?" Liam gasped, his voice a mix of awe and confusion. The girl didn't answer, but Liam didn't need words. He could feel the power in the air, the raw energy she had released. She was stronger than he had realized, more dangerous than he could have imagined. But that didn't make him feel any less responsible for her. In fact, it made him feel more determined. Whoever was after her was clearly prepared to stop at nothing. And now that they knew she was with him, they were going to keep coming. Liam had no choice but to protect her. He steered the ship toward a nearby asteroid field, hoping to lose the pursuers in the dense rocks. The enemy fleet followed, but the asteroid field was treacherous. Liam's ship swerved and dodged between the floating rocks, using the natural terrain as cover. The enemy ships struggled to keep up, their larger size making it harder for them to maneuver. Liam's hands gripped the controls tighter, his mind focused on getting through the field. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. One wrong turn, and they'd be caught. He glanced at the girl again. She was still silent, her eyes closed as if she were concentrating, but Liam could feel her energy in the air. The pursuit seemed to slow, but Liam knew it was only temporary. He had to make it to a hidden location, a place they couldn't track. He pushed the ship to its limits, the engines roaring as they sped through the field. Just as they emerged on the other side of the asteroid belt, Liam spotted a small, uninhabited moon. It was perfect, isolated, far from the fleet, and covered in thick forests that would hide them from scanners. He aimed for the moon, setting a course for a remote landing site. The ships behind them were still in pursuit, but Liam didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The girl's life, and his, depended on him getting them both to safety. As they descended toward the moon's surface, Liam let out a breath. They weren't safe yet, but they had a chance. And that was all he could ask for. Liam's heart pounded as he landed the ship on the surface of the moon. The soft thud of the ship's landing gear hitting the ground was the only sound that broke the tense silence. Outside, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of trees and damp soil. The moon was untouched, its thick forests and rocky terrain the perfect hiding place. He powered down the ship's engines, taking a moment to catch his breath. The pursuit ships were still out there somewhere, but he had lost them in the dense asteroid field. For now, they were safe. But how long would it last? Liam turned to the girl, still strapped in her seat. She hadn't said a word since the encounter with the enemy ships, but her glowing hands had spoken volumes. She had powers, real powers, that he didn't fully understand. And if she had that much power, why was she in trouble? Why were they chasing her so desperately? He had so many questions, but right now, there was one thing he needed to focus on, getting them both out of the ship and into safety. He didn't know how long they could stay here before the enemy found them again. Liam opened the hatch and stepped outside, the cool air rushing into the ship. The moon was eerily quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of creatures he couldn't see. He scanned the horizon, making sure there was no sign of other ships. Everything seemed calm for now. The girl was still sitting in the cockpit, her eyes closed, but she wasn't asleep. Liam noticed her fingers twitching as if she were concentrating on something far away. "Hey," Liam called softly. "We need to move. It's safer out there." She didn't respond, but after a moment, her eyes fluttered open. They glowed faintly, the same otherworldly glow that had terrified him before. But this time, it didn't feel threatening. It was just her. Liam hesitated but then offered his hand to her. She didn't take it immediately, but after another moment, she slowly unbuckled herself from the seat and stood. She was graceful, even in her weakened state, but something about her movements seemed different, like she was holding back something powerful, something dangerous. Without speaking, she followed Liam as he led her out of the ship. He glanced back at her, trying to gauge what she was thinking, but it was hard to read her expression. Her face was calm, almost serene, but there was an intensity in her eyes that made Liam uneasy. She was holding back something, and he wasn't sure what it was. "Do you have a name?" Liam asked, his voice tentative. "I need to know what to call you." The girl didn't answer at first. Then, after a long pause, she spoke, her voice not through words but directly in his mind. "I am called Lyra." Liam blinked, surprised at the telepathic response. He had heard of telepaths, but this was different. Lyra wasn't just speaking in his head. It felt like her thoughts were reaching deep into his mind. He could almost feel her presence, like she was standing right next to him, even though she wasn't saying anything aloud. "Lyra," Liam repeated, trying to get used to the name. It felt strange, almost foreign, but it was a start. "Why are they after you?" Lyra paused for a moment, her eyes distant as if she were searching for the right words. I do not know. I was taken, kept hidden. They want what is inside me. Liam didn't press her for more. Whatever she was talking about, it wasn't something she was ready to explain yet, and that was fine. He could tell by the way she spoke that it was something painful, something that had scared her. He turned to lead her into the forest, the trees looming tall and dense. The ground was soft beneath his boots, the quiet of the place almost peaceful. But Liam couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. They needed to find shelter and figure out what to do next. As they moved deeper into the forest, Liam could hear the faint hum of machinery, the sounds of ships still searching above. The enemy wasn't going to give up easily. They were relentless, and it was only a matter of time before they started scanning the planet's surface for heat signatures. "Lyra, we need to keep moving. I'm sure they'll find us soon," Liam said, his voice low. He didn't want to scare her, but he couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. She nodded, her expression unchanged, but Liam could sense her mind was working. It was almost like she was calculating, planning something. He wasn't sure if she was ready to share that yet, but he didn't press. They walked for what felt like hours, moving deeper into the forest, until the trees grew thicker and the light began to fade. The air grew colder, but it wasn't unpleasant. Liam found a small cave hidden behind a thick curtain of vines and moss. It was the perfect place to rest and regroup. Once inside, Liam set up a small camp, a fire to keep them warm, and a few supplies he had brought along. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. The cave was secluded, hidden from prying eyes, and that was all that mattered. Lyra sat quietly by the fire, her gaze distant. She hadn't said much since they arrived, and Liam didn't want to push her too hard. He knew she was in pain, physically and emotionally. Whatever had happened to her, it was clear that she wasn't just a normal traveler. She was part of something much bigger. Liam glanced at her, wondering what the future held. He had never been part of anything like this before. He was just a scavenger, someone who lived by his wits and kept to himself. But now, with Lyra in his life, everything had changed. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. His mind drifted back to the ships chasing them. They weren't just after a person. They were after something more. And whatever that something was, it was inside Lyra. The fire crackled in the silence, and Liam leaned back against the cold stone wall of the cave. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. He couldn't leave her. No matter what the enemy wanted, no matter how dangerous things got, he wasn't going to let her go. Lyra's telepathic voice broke through his thoughts, soft but clear. "Thank you, Liam." Liam looked at her, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He didn't need words to know what she meant. They were in this together now, and he would protect her, no matter what. The next morning, the sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Liam woke up. The air outside was still cool, and the sky was streaked with colors of purple and orange as the new day began. The fire in the cave had burned low, leaving only faint embers glowing in the corner. Liam rubbed his eyes and stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. The night had been long, filled with quiet moments of worry and uncertainty. But now, as the first light of the day filtered through the trees outside, he knew they had to keep moving. The enemy ships would be back soon enough, and they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. He turned to look at Lyra, still sitting by the fire. She hadn't slept much, if at all. Her eyes were still bright, glowing faintly, but there was a calmness to her that Liam didn't quite understand. Despite everything that had happened, despite the danger and uncertainty, she seemed at peace. Liam had never met anyone like her before. He had spent his life traveling alone, never needing anyone or anything. But now, with Lyra by his side, he realized that his life had changed in ways he couldn't explain. She was more than just a person. She was something powerful, something that held the key to whatever it was that had brought them both into this strange, dangerous situation. He stood up and walked over to her, She didn't look at him right away, but he could feel her awareness, as if she knew he was there without needing to see him. "We need to move," Liam said, breaking the silence. "We can't stay here forever. They'll find us soon." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes still glowing faintly. Her voice echoed in his mind, soft and calm. "I know. I feel them coming." Liam blinked. "You can feel them." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "They are searching for me. They know where I am." Liam's stomach tightened at the thought. Whoever they were, they had resources. They had tracked him across space, and now they were closing in on them, searching the surface of this moon. "We can't stay here," Liam said again, his voice firm. "We need to keep moving, get to another hiding spot." Lyra didn't argue. She stood up slowly, her movements fluid and graceful, like she was in control of her every step. For a moment, Liam wondered how much of her power was inside her, hidden beneath her calm exterior. As they left the cave and stepped into the woods, the sounds of distant engines filled the air again. The enemy ships were coming. Liam could hear them, getting closer with each passing minute. But there was something different this time. It wasn't just the noise of ships. It was the sense of purpose behind it. They were getting closer. They knew they were near. "We need to move fast," Liam said, quickening his pace. "Stay close." Lyra followed without a word, her footsteps silent on the forest floor. The trees around them were dense, but Liam had been on this moon long enough to know it like the back of his hand. There was a path, hidden among the undergrowth, that led to an old research facility. It wasn't much, but it was far enough away from the main areas that they could hide for a while. As they moved, Liam couldn't help but notice the change in Lyra. She was different than she had been the day before. She wasn't just walking beside him. She was ahead of him now, moving with a purpose he couldn't fully understand. It was as if something inside her was waking up, something he had only glimpsed in the brief moments when she had used her powers. "What's happening to you?" Liam asked, unable to hold it in any longer. Lyra stopped, her head tilting slightly as if she had to consider his question. Then, in the quiet of his mind, her voice answered, "The power inside me is waking. It's been dormant for a long time, but it's coming back. The more I use it, the stronger it becomes." Liam could feel the weight of her words. She wasn't just talking about physical strength or speed. She was talking about something much bigger. He didn't fully understand it, but he could feel it. There was a storm of energy inside her, something that was only beginning to stir. "Are you okay?" Liam asked, concerned. "Is it dangerous for you?" "I don't know," she responded softly. "But I must learn to control it. It is the only way to survive." They continued walking, the urgency of the situation pushing them forward. The distant sound of engines was growing louder now, closer than before. Liam could feel the pressure building. They had to find shelter. They couldn't afford to be caught out in the open. Finally, after what felt like hours of trekking through the dense forest, they arrived at the abandoned facility. It was a small, rundown complex that had once been used for research. Now, it was just a forgotten relic, hidden from view. It was perfect. Liam quickly moved to the door, but as he approached, a sound stopped him. A low, mechanical hum. His heart skipped a beat. The enemy ships were getting closer, and now they were beginning to scan the ground below. He could feel their searchlights sweeping over the landscape, looking for any sign of heat signatures. "We have to get inside now," Liam said urgently. Lyra nodded, and together they made their way inside the facility. The door creaked open with a loud screech, and they slipped inside, finding cover behind a row of rusted equipment. The building was dimly lit, with only the faintest light filtering through broken windows. Liam crouched low, peering out through a crack in the wall. He could see the enemy ships above, their searchlights cutting through the trees. The sound of their engines filled the air, and for a moment, Liam felt like they were being hunted. "We can't stay here for long," Liam said, his voice tight. "They'll find us eventually." Lyra didn't respond, but Liam could feel the quiet power inside her, the energy pulsing just beneath the surface. It was both comforting and terrifying. He wasn't sure what kind of power she had, but he knew one thing. Whatever it was, it would make all the difference in the coming fight. And he would be ready for it. He had to be. The hours passed slowly inside the abandoned research facility. Liam stayed near the cracked window, watching the enemy ships circle above, their searchlights sweeping over the dense forest like hungry predators. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with every passing minute. They couldn't stay here much longer. Sooner or later, the enemy would find them. And when they did, there would be no hiding. Lyra sat in the corner of the room, her legs crossed, her eyes closed in deep concentration. Her breathing was steady, but there was a sense of tension in the air around her. The power inside her had grown stronger since they'd arrived on this moon. Liam could feel it, even if he didn't understand it completely. She was more than just a person now. She was something else, something powerful. Liam couldn't help but wonder how much of this power was her own. Had she always had it, or had it been awakened by something else? Something he didn't yet know. Every time she used her abilities, it felt like she was tapping into something ancient, something beyond his understanding. He turned away from the window and glanced over at her. She seemed lost in thought, her fingers twitching slightly as if she were controlling something invisible in the air. Her eyes opened suddenly, meeting his, and Liam felt a shiver run down his spine. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze, a silent understanding between them. "We can't stay here forever," Liam said quietly. "They'll find us eventually. We need to make a plan." Lyra nodded slowly, but there was something else in her eyes, a hint of uncertainty. She wasn't as calm as she appeared. Whatever power was inside her, it was still something she was trying to control. And the more she used it, the more unpredictable it became. "I don't know if I can control it," she said, her voice soft but heavy with fear. It's like something inside me is waking up, but I can't stop it. I don't know what will happen if I lose control." Liam frowned. He hadn't fully understood the extent of her powers, but it was clear now that they were dangerous, not just to their enemies, but to her as well. Whatever this power was, it wasn't something she could easily manage. "We'll figure it out," Liam said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "You're not alone in this. We'll find a way to control it." She didn't answer, but Liam could feel her quiet trust in him. He wasn't sure if he was capable of helping her, but he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't leave her. Not now. A faint sound echoed from outside, a low rumble that sent a chill down Liam's spine. He turned toward the door, his hand instinctively reaching for his blaster. The enemy ships were coming closer, their engines growing louder with each passing second. They were getting ready to land. Liam motioned for Lyra to stay low, and she nodded, her expression unreadable. They both knew what was coming. The enemy wasn't going to stop until they had her. And from what Liam could tell, they wouldn't hesitate to destroy everything in their path to get to her. Liam moved toward the back of the facility, his mind racing. They needed to escape, but the only way out was through the woods, and the enemy ships were already circling the area. There was no way they could outrun them, not on foot. He had to think of something else. Suddenly, an idea struck him. It was risky, but it might be their only chance. "I have a ship," Liam said, turning back to Lyra. "It's hidden just outside the facility. We can use it to escape, but we have to get there before they see us." Lyra stood up, her eyes glowing faintly with a mix of uncertainty and determination. "You have a ship?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we trust it?" Liam nodded. "It's old, but it works. I've used it to get out of trouble before. We don't have much time. We have to move now." The sound of the enemy ships grew louder, and Liam's heart raced. They were almost there. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the danger pressing in on them. They had to act fast. Liam led the way out of the facility, moving as quietly as he could through the dense undergrowth. The trees above provided some cover, but the searchlights from the enemy ships were still sweeping the area, and he could feel the tension in the air as if they were being hunted. He kept his eyes on the ground, making sure not to make a sound. Every step felt like a risk. They reached the edge of the forest, where Liam had hidden his ship. It was small, a makeshift vessel cobbled together from parts of other ships, but it was fast and sturdy. It wasn't much, but it was enough for this. Liam moved quickly, unlocking the hatch and climbing inside. He gestured for Lyra to follow, and she hesitated for a moment before climbing in beside him. The ship's systems came to life with a low hum, and Liam began to power up the engines. He could feel the ship shaking slightly as it started to warm up. They didn't have much time before the enemy ships would be upon them. Lyra sat still beside him, her eyes closed in concentration. Liam could feel her energy, her power, like a constant hum in the air around them. It was both comforting and terrifying. He knew she was doing something, focusing, trying to control the power inside her, but he wasn't sure what would happen if she lost control. He didn't know what kind of damage she could cause. "We need to get to orbit," Liam said, his voice tense. "We can't outrun them here. We have to break through the atmosphere and disappear into space." Lyra nodded, her face a mask of concentration. "I'll help," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can feel them coming. I'll make sure we don't get caught." Liam didn't know how she would do it, but he trusted her. He punched in the coordinates for orbit and throttled up the engines. The ship's hull groaned as it lifted off the ground, the trees rushing by beneath them. They were on their way. Now it was a race against time. The ship shot into the sky, the engines roaring as it broke through the atmosphere. Liam could feel the rumble of the thrusters beneath his feet, the air outside growing thinner as they ascended. The trees below were quickly disappearing, and soon they were surrounded by the cold vastness of space. But even in the silence of the void, the enemy was close. Liam knew that the enemy ships weren't far behind. They would follow them, no matter where they went. And Lyra, she still didn't fully understand the extent of her own power. Every second that passed, he could feel her energy building. He wasn't sure if it was a good thing or a dangerous one. "We need to make it to the asteroid belt," Liam said, his voice tense. "If we can hide there, we can lose them. It's the only chance we have." Lyra didn't respond, but he could feel her focus, a quiet presence in his mind. She was still concentrating, still working on something he didn't fully understand. She had told him she would help, but he wasn't sure what kind of help that would be. The ship shook again, and Liam's grip tightened on the controls. The enemy ships were gaining on them, and he could hear their engines humming in the distance. They had to get to the asteroid belt before the enemy ships could close the gap. "They're coming," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of certainty. Liam's heart skipped a beat. They were here. In the distance, he saw them. 3 sleek black ships, cutting through the darkness like shadows. They were faster than his ship, and they had better technology. He knew they wouldn't give up. They would chase him to the ends of the galaxy if it meant capturing Lyra. He gritted his teeth and pushed the throttle forward, the ship accelerating as they headed toward the asteroid belt. It wasn't much of a shield. The asteroids were scattered, but there were too many to navigate through quickly. The enemy ships would follow, and they would use their advanced sensors to track them. "We can't outrun them forever," Liam muttered. "We need a plan." Lyra's hand twitched beside him, and suddenly, he felt it. A surge of power. It was like a sudden wave of energy, flooding through the ship, making the air crackle. He glanced at her, but she didn't look at him. Her eyes were closed, her fingers trembling. "I'm trying," she whispered in his mind. "But it's hard to control." Liam didn't know what to say. He had no idea what she was doing, but the pressure in the air was thick, like the calm before a storm. The enemy ships were closing in, But there was something else in the air now. Something different. "Do it now," Liam said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Lyra, please. We can't keep running." Lyra's fingers curled into a fist, and suddenly the ship lurched forward. Liam's breath caught in his throat as the ship shot forward with an unexpected burst of speed. It was faster than it had ever been, as if Lyra had unlocked some hidden power within the ship itself. The enemy ships were still there, but they were falling behind. Liam glanced at Lyra, his eyes wide. "What did you do?" Lyra opened her eyes, and for the first time since they had met, he saw a small smile on her face. But it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was something else, something dark and focused. "I'm controlling it," she said softly. "But it's not enough." Liam felt his stomach tighten. There was something in her voice that told him this wasn't over. They were far from safe. Whatever power Lyra had awakened, it was powerful, but it came with a cost. He wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it under control. Ahead, the asteroid belt loomed, a scattered field of rocks and debris. It was a dangerous place, but it was their only hope. The enemy ships were right behind them, their pursuit relentless. They were almost there. They just needed to reach the safety of the belt. Liam's hands flew over the controls, weaving the ship between the massive asteroids. The ship's sensors flashed warnings, but Liam didn't slow down. The enemy ships were closing in, and he could hear their engines grow louder, almost deafening. "Lyra," Liam said, his voice strained. "We have to make it. Help me get us through." Lyra didn't respond, but the energy around her intensified. The air crackled, and Liam could feel her presence in his mind. Stronger now, almost overwhelming. It was like she was tapping into something vast, something beyond anything he could comprehend. The power inside her was growing, and it was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. As they neared the asteroid belt, Liam saw an opening in the field of rocks, a narrow gap between two massive asteroids. He steered the ship toward it, but the enemy ships weren't far behind. They were getting ready to fire, to take them out before they could escape. And then, Lyra's power surge. It was like a wave of force, invisible and intense. The enemy ships seemed to falter, their engines sputtering as if something had disrupted their systems. Liam's eyes widened as the ships began to lose control, drifting off course as Lyra's power reached out and interfered with their technology. "Hold on," Liam shouted, pushing the ship forward with all the speed it could muster. The gap in the asteroids was close now, and they were almost through. With one final burst of energy, the ship shot through the gap, the asteroid field closing in around them. The enemy ships had been left behind, their pursuit broken by the power Lyra had unleashed. They were free. Liam let out a long breath, his hands shaking as he took control of the ship again. He glanced at Lyra, who was still sitting beside him, her eyes closed, her breathing heavy. "We made it," she whispered, her voice soft and distant. Liam didn't respond. He didn't need to. The danger was over. For now. They had escaped. But the road ahead was still uncertain. The enemy wouldn't stop. And Lyra's power, it was only just beginning to reveal itself. But whatever came next, they would face it together.